Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to be talking about the latest in a series of games by Reiner Knizia, a rather famous designer, by the name of Lost Cities Roll and Write. Lost Cities was originally a card game, maybe about 25 years old at this point. That it was a two-player only card game that has inspired several spin-offs over the years, including the Celtis series of games, which uses its basic core mechanic of using numbers to progress up a track to score points. This game is very much in the mold of the games that have come before, but it uses the roll and write mechanic that's really exploded in popularity over the last 5 years or so in a way that I think still manages to stay true to the Lost Cities core board game experience. I will take a few minutes to show you how the game plays, and then we'll come back and let you know what I think about it. Lost Cities Roll and Write is going to be pretty straightforward if you've played another Lost Cities game, or I suppose if you've played another Roll and Write game. At the start of the game, each player is going to get a score sheet. The game plays from 2 to 5 players, and a start player is going to be given these 6 dice, and each turn the active player is going to roll the 6 dice, and in most cases are going to draft 2 of those dice from the pool and form a number and color combination to write onto their score sheet. The other dice that weren't drafted will be available to the other players who can then make their own combinations. Again, all of these 4 dice are available to all players, so multiple players could use the same color or number die from that pool. If any player, whether it's the active player or the other players, doesn't want to create a combination from the dice that were rolled, they can instead just mark off on this row, or this column rather, the lowest unoccupied pitcher of dice. So they could, for example, do that and not have to take any of these dice. And if the active player does that, all 6 dice will be available to the other players. Then, once all players have made their decision, the dice will simply pass to the next player, who will roll all 6 dice, take 2 probably, and leave the other 4 for the other players. So what you're trying to do in the game is relatively similar to the Lost Cities card game or the Lost Cities board game, and that is to progress up these 6 different columns, putting in numbers from low and eventually going high. You can see over here there are points on the score track for each of the columns, so I'll just show you that closely. And you can see if you start on a column, you're going to go into the negative at the start of the game, and it takes several steps before you get positive points, but it'll eventually pay off if you max out a column. So there's a risk involved in starting a column, and certainly based on the number of players that are in the game, you may not want to start all of the different columns. Also, you'll notice on the column there are these little symbols. These are simply, whenever you fill in a number, you could then fill in another number in a column that you've already started, the same number. And there are these little pots. Whenever you fill in a space with the pot, you get to cross out a pot on this pot track, which will give you points at the end of the game based on this side of the board over here. So the rule, as in the Lost Cities card game, is that when you roll the dice, when you put a number in, so let's say I rolled the dice here, I would have, well, this would be a terrible roll. Let's just say, though, I took a 6 orange. I would write that number in at the bottom of my 6 column in the first square, and then what I would have to do from then on in the orange column, I could only write a 6 or higher in each successive space going up. So generally, you want to start low in each given column because that will give you more room to grow going forward. You'll notice that there are on the columns at a certain point on each column, including the 2 columns for the pottery and for the dice, passing on dice space, you have these 20-point markers. Those are first come, first serve for the first person to cross that threshold. They're called bridges in the rule book. They would get those 20 points. So, for example, if you were the first person to get your orange column up to that space, you would get this 20 points. Other players would cross that out. That's one of the game end triggers. If collectively among all players, all of the 20-point markers have been scored, you would simply stop playing at the end of that round. The other game end trigger is if every player has exhausted this column here by passing, then the game would also end at the end of that round. If, however, you exhaust that column early and you have no more markers to X, you could pass. You just simply don't fill in anything else on your board. The penalty, though, however, is you can see that the score track for these columns here, if you get the last one crossed out here, it goes down to 0 points. Whereas if you were on this space, you would get 70 points if you never crossed out the top pass icon on this board. So the only other wrinkle to the game, I guess, is at the start of the game. You'll notice that there are these little expedition, I guess they're bet markers, which is essentially at the start of the game, before you've even filled in your first number in a given column. If ever you take a 0 and a color, you could cross that out instead, and then you would simply double your points for that column, not for the bridge, but for the points that are on this side of the board for every X that you have down here. So that is just, again, doubling down a risk-reward element of the game that's similar to what is in the card game. You have to do that, again, before you filled in a marker, using a 0 and a die of the given color. I will say that once you start on the track, so in this case, like if I took a 0-6, or I'm sorry, if I took a 0 in orange, that would count as a 10 going forward. So the first number can only be a 1 at the bottom. You can't do a 0 at the bottom. It would count as a 10 once you're actually on the track. It only is used as a 0 for filling in one of these markers down at the bottom. And then I suppose the only other thing is if you're at the top, you have the top block filled in. If you roll the same number or higher with that color, you get to cross off one of those little pots. You can only do that once per column, but it does progress you up on the pot track. So I have a score sheet here just to show you an example of what things would look like once you've finished the game. This was from a 2-player game, so both players made a lot of progress on this, and you could see that this player opted not to start on one of the columns, and you could just see that there were quite a few columns that got close to being maxed out. But if you do have more players, that's you'll have to play a little bit more conservatively because you won't make as much progress before the game end is triggered. But it does give you a sense of what sort of progress you can make in the game. And generally speaking, that's how you are going to play Lost Cities Roll and Write. Okay, so that is Lost Cities Roll and Write, and I think, as I said at the start of that explanation, if you've played Lost Cities before, you'll feel right at home when you're playing this game. I think that the game, by switching to being a roll and write game, is definitely amps up in some regards the press your luck element of the original Lost Cities, where sometimes you were really, making moves that mathematically didn't make sense, but just in the hopes that they would pay off. But it might lose some of the tension of holding back cards, that you get in Lost Cities, just because you know that they would be really beneficial for your opponent. There is dice drafting in this, and you can draft a pair of dice if you're the active player to keep them from, your opponent. But I think that those are very opportunistic moves that aren't really a strategic consideration like they are in the card game versions of Lost Cities. I think that goes without saying that most dice games are more tactical in nature than most card games, and that's definitely true in this case. I think that, in most cases, I have to say that I would choose to play one of the Lost Cities card games over this game, but this still feels like a very solid design, and it compares favorably with a lot of roll and writes that have come out in recent years. It's very straightforward, and even though there's not a lot of re-rolling and whatnot, it does keep the game focused, and it does force you into some of the tough decisions that you would have in the other Lost Cities games. The fact that it doesn't let you do dice manipulation initially felt like a problem to me until I realized just how many options you have to pass on the dice. You have virtually unlimited options if you want to take them to pass on taking bad dice. Of course, you have a terrible game where nothing seems to go your way just because of the dice. But the fact that you're never forced into taking dice does mitigate that feeling somewhat. But I think that overall, if you're looking for a game that has no luck in it, this definitely isn't that. It has definitely more luck than the Lost Cities card games. I will just say that first of all, this does play to 5, which I think is unique to these Lost Cities games. Maybe one of the board games might, but I don't think so. I think they cap out at 4, and so the original Lost Cities card game is only 2-player, but there is a Keltis card game, which is probably, if not my favorite in the series, one of the best in the series, that does play 4 as well. And that would probably be my recommendation if I was going to say, to seek out anything in the series. It's called Keltis, the card game. I believe it was only released in Germany. This one is going to be, this one's an American release. It's also released in Europe, and it's, more readily available. I think that Keltis card game is not so easily obtainable these days. Hopefully it comes back in print. But, there's certainly for a $10 or $15 game, there's a lot, you could do a lot worse. What is interesting is that because every player is involved on every turn, the game does sustain tension, and you're often hoping that the person doesn't pick after they roll. Even if you're the passive player, you're hoping that they don't take the die that you need, and that just makes the game feel involving. And the box says that it runs about 30 minutes. I would say it runs more like 20 minutes in general, because even if you scale up the number of players, the requirements to just score the same, I think, 8 bridges over the course of the game, which is usually how the game is going to end, doesn't go up with more players. So more players are taking turns, but generally speaking, everybody's filling in something every turn. So I wouldn't say that the 30 minutes is quite accurate. It's more of a 20-minute game or so. And it does have actual decisions, considering how, you don't have dice manipulation. A lot of the roll and rate games that have come out over the recent years have gotten increasingly complex, which I like some of those games, like Gone Shun Clever I really enjoy. I really like some of the heavier ones for sure, but there is something refreshing about playing one that's so straightforward and immediately clear what you should be doing to players. So I would say if you have a tolerance for yet another roll and write game, and you aren't exhausted by the the scoring systems and the overall gameplay of Lost Cities games to date, then this is well worth playing. It's just a question of if you need another roll and write, if you need another Lost Cities game, that's going to be, I think, for you to decide based on the size of your collection and whatnot. So those are my thoughts on Lost City Roll and Write, and thank you for watching.